I was lying on that table, staring up at the fluorescent light, when I heard her say it. Make sure his wife gets this before he's discharged. Don't let him see what's inside. My cardiologist, Dr. Renata Okafor, the woman who had been monitoring my heart for 11 years. I recognized her voice the same way I recognized the sound of my own front door, without thinking, without question. She was standing just outside the curtain, maybe 3 feet from where I lay with electrodes still stuck to my chest, and she was talking to someone in a low, deliberate voice that people use when they don't want to be overheard. I kept my eyes closed. I slowed my breathing. 38 years in commercial real estate teaches you when to stay quiet and listen. The orderly had told me the sedative for the stress test would make me drowsy, but not unconscious. He'd said most people drift off. I hadn't. I never do. My wife used to say I could sleep through a thunderstorm, but never through silence. That something in me always woke up when things got too quiet. She wasn't wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything else. Her name was Lorraine. We had been married for 31 years. Let me go back a little, because the story doesn't make sense without the context, and I want it to make sense. I'm 64 years old. I spent most of my adult life building a property management company in the Ottawa Valley. Nothing spectacular, but solid. Residential units, a few small commercial leases, a strip mall in Renfrew that we picked up in '09 when prices collapsed. My father had been a contractor. I grew up understanding that land was the only thing that didn't disappear. Lorraine and I met at a New Year's party in 1992. She was 31, teaching music at a Catholic secondary school in Kanata. I was 33, just starting to feel like the business might actually survive. She was the kind of woman who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. That's not a cliché when you've actually experienced it. She played piano. She made her own bread on Sunday mornings. She remembered the names of everyone's children. We got married that October in a small ceremony at Sacred Heart in Cardleton Place. Her parents cried. My mother said she was too good for me. She was probably right about that too. We had 2 children. Our son, who I'll call by his middle name, James. He's 38 now, lives in Calgary, works in oil and gas. Our daughter, who I'll call by her name, Petra. She's 34, married a man named Scott, lives 20 minutes from us in Almonte. Petra called every Sunday without fail. She and Lorraine were close in the way mothers and daughters are close when they both understand the same kind of loneliness. I missed things. I know that now. I was at the office too many evenings. I took calls during dinners. I flew to Toronto for meetings that could have been handled by email. Lorraine never complained, or rather, she complained early in the marriage and then stopped, and I told myself that meant things had improved. That was stupid of me. When someone stops complaining, it doesn't always mean things are fine. Sometimes it means they've started making other plans. I had my first heart episode in the spring of 2021. Nothing catastrophic, an irregular rhythm that showed up during a routine check. Dr. Okafor scheduled quarterly stress tests and put me on a blood thinner. She was meticulous, thorough, the kind of doctor who called you back herself instead of having the receptionist do it. I trusted her completely. By 2023, the tests were routine enough that I barely dreaded them. I'd go in, they'd stick the leads on my chest, I'd walk on the treadmill until my heart rate hit the target, then they'd give me a mild sedative and let me rest for 40 minutes before discharge. Lorraine usually drove me. She'd sit in the waiting room with a library book and a Tim Hortons medium double, and when the nurse came out she'd fold her bookmark carefully, put the book in her purse, and come find me. That October morning, she dropped me at the entrance and told me she'd park and come in. Standard routine. I went through registration, got changed, got wired up. The test itself was uneventful. When it was over, I lay on the cot behind the curtain in the recovery bay and let my heart rate come down and did what I always did. I pretended to sleep, but didn't. That's when I heard Dr. Okafor's voice, 3 feet away, quiet and deliberate. Make sure his wife gets this before he's discharged. Don't let him see what's inside. A pause. Then a different voice, younger, one of the nurses, said, "Of course. Should I call her in now?" "Give it 10 more minutes. I want his numbers to stabilize first." I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes. My heart, the one they were monitoring, was doing something the machine probably wasn't going to like, but I controlled my breathing and kept absolutely still and thought, what is in that envelope? And more importantly, why does my wife already know it's coming? Because that was the thing. The nurse hadn't asked who his wife was, or whether she was there, or how to reach her. She'd said, "Should I call her in now?" As if it had already been arranged. As if Lorraine was already waiting for exactly this. When the nurse came to check my vitals 20 minutes later, I asked her how much longer. She said probably another 10 minutes. I asked if my wife had been called in yet. She hesitated, just slightly, just a flicker, and said she wasn't sure. She'd go check. She didn't come back for 15 minutes. When she did, she said my wife had stepped out to move the car. Lorraine drove us home on the 417. She talked about the traffic near the Pinecrest ramp, about a recipe she'd seen in Canadian Living, about Petra's youngest having a cold. Normal. Easy. The kind of conversation that fills a car without asking anything of either person. I watched her hands on the wheel and thought about the 11 years of appointments and the way she always had the Tim Hortons ready and the library book folded carefully, and I thought, how long? How long have you been carrying something I wasn't supposed to see? I didn't say anything that day. I've always been better at listening than at confronting, and I knew that whatever was in that envelope, I needed more information before I said a single word. In real estate, you never negotiate before you've read the full file. It took me 4 days to find out what Dr. Okafor had sent her. I want to be clear that I'm not proud of how I found out. I went through my wife's things. I went through the zippered inside pocket of the purse she kept on the hook by the back door, the one she'd carried for 3 years and considered too practical to replace. I waited until she was at her Thursday afternoon piano lesson. She'd gone back to playing herself after she retired from teaching, and I sat at the kitchen table in our house in Almonte with the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, and I read what Dr. Okafor had given her. It wasn't a medical document. It was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten on notepaper from the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. It was addressed to my wife. It was signed by a man named Jeffrey. I had to read it twice before I understood what I was reading, and then I had to stand up and walk outside and stand in the backyard for a while, looking at the garden Lorraine had planted along the back fence. The rose bushes she'd put in the year Petra was born, now overgrown and leggy in the October cold. Jeffrey, the letter referred to things I will not describe in detail, but which made the nature of the relationship entirely clear. It also referred to a conversation, a plan involving the house. Our house, the house we bought in 1998, the one we paid off in 2017, the one that was in both our names and was, not coincidentally, worth approximately $840,000 in the current market. The letter said they'd spoken to someone and that the timeline could work if things moved by spring. It said he was looking at a place in Portugal. It said he hoped she understood that the boys, I had no idea who the boys were on board, and that the only remaining piece was the transfer. The transfer. I went back inside. I made myself a coffee. I sat down and thought carefully. The first thing I thought was, Dr. Okafor, why? Why would a cardiologist, my cardiologist, a woman I trusted for 11 years, be the conduit for a letter from my wife's lover? The answer came to me slowly, and then, all at once, the way bad answers usually do. Lorraine had a physical scheduled with the same clinic. She would have seen Dr. Okofal's name in the building directory. She would have contacted her outside of the professional relationship, perhaps through a mutual acquaintance. The Ottawa Valley medical community is not enormous, and arranged for the handoff to happen somewhere I couldn't question it. Somewhere I would be sedated and monitored and couldn't make a scene. It was, I had to admit, well planned. The second thing I thought was, James. I needed to talk to James. I called him that evening from my car, parked in the lot behind the Renfrew Tim Hortons, where I sometimes went to think. He picked up on the third ring. I told him I needed to tell him something, and that I needed him to listen before he said anything. He said okay. He said okay in the voice he'd used as a teenager when he knew something serious was coming. I told him, not everything, not the letter, not Jeffrey, not the house, but enough. I told him I'd overheard something at the cardiologist's office. I told him I thought his mother had been planning something that affected the house and our finances, and that I needed a few weeks to understand the full picture before I did anything. James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Dad, how long do you think this has been going on? I said I didn't know. He said, Petra knew something was wrong. She mentioned it to me back in the summer. She said Mom seemed distracted, off. She asked me if you two were okay, and I told her I thought so. So Petra had noticed. Petra, who called every Sunday without fail, who understood the same kind of loneliness. She had noticed and hadn't said anything to me, probably to protect me, probably because she didn't know what she was noticing. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I'd spent my entire career learning how to do. I gathered information. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my behavior. I came home at the usual time. I ate dinner. I asked about the recipe from Canadian Living. I watched hockey on Thursday nights. I was the same man I'd always been, or close enough that she didn't notice the difference. What I was doing quietly on lunch hours and weekend mornings was building a picture. Jeffrey turned out to be Jeffrey Marsh, 61 years old, semi-retired, formerly in financial services. He'd grown up in Ottawa and moved to the Gatineau Hills sometime in the mid-2010s. He had a property there. I confirmed it through the provincial registry, a farmhouse on 12 acres that he purchased in 2018. The Chateau Laurier notepaper, I guessed, was from a meeting in the city, not necessarily from him being a guest there. The boys were, as best as I could determine, his 2 adult sons from a previous marriage. I found them through their father's LinkedIn connections. Both were in their 30s. One worked in finance in Montreal. The other appeared to be in real estate. There it was again, real estate, operating a small development company out of the Pontiac. I hired a lawyer, not a family lawyer, a corporate lawyer first, to help me understand what could and couldn't be done with jointly held property without the other spouse's knowledge or consent. The answer, under Ontario law, was not much and not quickly. But Portugal was not Ontario, and if money moved before separation agreement was filed, it moved. I also went back to see Dr. Okafor. I made an appointment, a legitimate one, a follow-up, and I sat across from her in her office, and I was very calm, and I told her what I'd overheard. I told her I wasn't angry with her, which wasn't entirely true, but I needed her to understand that I knew, and that I was asking her, as the person who had monitored my heart for 11 years, to tell me what she knew. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that a mutual acquaintance had asked her, as a personal favor, to pass along a piece of correspondence in a setting where there would be no awkwardness. She said she hadn't read the letter. She said she hadn't understood the full implications of what she was facilitating. I said, "Do you understand now?" She said yes. She also said something else, which I didn't expect. She said, "I'm glad you came back. I've been sitting with this for 3 weeks and I didn't know what to do with it." She paused. "Your wife called me 2 weeks ago and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about your cognition during the tests, whether you'd seemed confused, disoriented." I stared at her. She said, "I told her your results were normal across all measures and that I had no clinical concerns." She pushed back. I told her the same thing again. I understood then what I was actually up against. It wasn't just infidelity and the house transfer and the plan for Portugal. It was a preemptive attempt to establish, through a medical professional, that I was mentally declining. A groundwork being laid. The kind of thing that, if left unchallenged, could complicate a legal proceeding significantly. My lawyer, when I told him, went very quiet in the way that lawyers go quiet when they realize a case has become considerably more complicated and also considerably more serious. We filed a notice of claim against the property on a Tuesday morning in November. I also, on the advice of my lawyer, arranged for a comprehensive cognitive assessment at the Ottawa General, conducted by a neuropsychologist with no connection to my cardiologist's clinic. The results showed no impairment of any kind. My lawyer had the report sealed and held in trust. I also spoke to Petra. I drove to Almonte. She lives 20 minutes from the house, which now felt strange, knowing what was being planned, and I sat at her kitchen table while Scott took the kids to hockey practice, and I told her as much as I could without burdening her with the parts that would only hurt her. She cried. She said she'd had a feeling, she'd had it for months, and she was sorry she hadn't said anything. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I meant it. What she said next surprised me. She said, "He came to the house. Jeffrey. He came to the house when you were in Toronto for the Renfrew closing back in August. Mom introduced him as an old friend from university. He stayed for dinner. I didn't like him. He looked at everything in a certain way, like he was appraising it. Like he was appraising it." I thought about that for a long time afterward. A man who looked at a house like he was calculating its value. The 12 acres in the Gatineau Hills. A son in real estate in the Pontiac. And my wife, who had grown up watching her father lose the family farm in Prince Edward Island to a bad mortgage in 1987, who had spent her entire adult life understanding in her bones that land was the only thing that didn't disappear. She'd learned the same thing I had. She'd just decided to apply it differently. The day the notice of claim landed, I was at the Renfrew property doing a routine inspection when my lawyer called. He told me it had been served and that Lorraine's response, through her own lawyer, had been filed within the hour, which meant she'd had her own lawyer already retained and waiting. That was December. The next several months were what I will simply describe as the worst of my life, and I have had bad months. My father died when I was 42. I lost a partner to fraud in 2006, a situation that took 4 years and significant legal costs to resolve. I know what heart looks like. This was different. This was the specific particular devastation of sitting across a boardroom table from a woman you'd spent 31 years building a life with, and realizing that you did not know her the way you thought you did, and perhaps never had. I will not describe the proceedings in detail, except to say 3 things. First, the attempt to establish cognitive impairment failed entirely. The neuropsychological assessment was submitted. Lorraine's lawyer did not pursue the line of argument further. Second, the jointly held property remained intact through the process, because any transfer would have required my signature, and the notice of claim prevented any unilateral action. Jeffrey Marsh did not end up with 1,200 square feet of the Ottawa Valley. Third, Dr. Okafor provided, voluntarily and without being subpoenaed, a written account of the conversation in my recovery bay and a written account of Lorraine's subsequent call inquiring about my cognition. She submitted it, she told my lawyer, because she thought it was the right thing to do. She was right. It was. The settlement was reached in April, 8 months after I'd overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. The house was sold. We split the proceeds according to the agreement. James flew in from Calgary and stayed for a week. Petra brought food every second day and didn't talk about her mother when she didn't have to. I bought a smaller place, a semi-detached in Carlton Place, near the water, 3 blocks from where we got married. It needed work. The kitchen was 20 years out of date and the back deck had to be rebuilt from scratch. I hired a contractor, a young guy from Lanark who knew what he was doing, and I worked alongside him most weekends because I'd grown up in construction and I still knew how. And because working with your hands is the only thing that reliably quiets the particular kind of thinking that follows the end of a long marriage. It took most of the summer to get the place right. The deck came last. The contractor poured the footings on a Friday afternoon in August, and by the following Saturday we'd framed the whole thing out. Pressure-treated lumber, composite decking, a pergola on the east end because I wanted somewhere to sit in the morning without squinting into the sun. When we finished, I stood at the back of the lot and looked at what we built and thought about my father, who had poured concrete in this part of the country for 30 years and taught me that the only work worth doing is work that holds. Petra came over that evening with her husband and the kids. We sat on the new deck and drank iced tea and watched the kids chase each other around the small yard, and the light came through the neighbor's maple the way it does on August evenings in the Ottawa Valley, all gold and late and unhurried. She put her hand on my arm at one point. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I'd overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear in a curtained bay in a cardiology clinic on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd kept my eyes closed and my breathing slow, and I'd listened the way I'd learned to listen over 38 years of working in a business where the thing people say out loud is rarely the thing that matters. It saved me, not the listening, the acting on what I'd heard, the 4 days before I said a word to anyone, the 3 weeks of quiet, the lawyer on a Tuesday morning, the assessment at the Ottawa General, the willingness to rebuild from what was left, which turned out to be more than I'd expected. My son called on a Sunday evening in September, the kind of evening that comes in just before the days start turning. He asked how the deck was looking. I said it was holding up fine. He laughed. He said he'd been worried about me earlier in the year. I said I knew. He said he didn't need to worry anymore, did he? I looked out through the kitchen window at the yard, at the new pergola casting its long shadow across the composite boards, at the maple light fading over the fence. I told him no, he didn't need to worry anymore. I've thought about that October morning more times than I can count. The fluorescent light, the sound of the monitor, the way I slowed my breathing and stayed still and listened, not because I was clever, but because something in me had learned over 64 years that the moments worth paying attention to are often the ones where nobody thinks you're paying attention at all. What happened to me wasn't unusual, not really. People betray each other. Long marriages unravel in ways that are invisible from the outside and obvious, in hindsight from the inside. What I keep coming back to isn't the betrayal itself. It's the question of what I did with the 4 days between hearing that whisper and saying a single word to anyone. That gap, that deliberate, uncomfortable silence is the thing that made the difference. I've watched people blow up their lives by reacting before they understand. I've done it myself years ago in business when I confronted a partner over missing figures before I had the full picture and nearly lost the relationship and 2 years of work over something that turned out to have a reasonable explanation. I learned then that the impulse to act immediately is almost always about your own discomfort, not about solving the problem. You act fast because the uncertainty is unbearable, not because acting fast is wise. This time I waited. And while I waited, I thought about what I actually knew versus what I suspected. I thought about what could be proven versus what I believed. I hired the right people. I got the cognitive assessment not because I was frightened of what it might show, but because I understood that in a legal dispute, an uncontested record is worth more than any argument. That's not cleverness. That's just the discipline of choosing the harder thing when the easier thing feels so much more satisfying. Dr. Okafor did the right thing in the end. I think about her too. She'd made a mistake, not a malicious one, but a real one. The kind that comes from agreeing to a small favor without thinking through what that favor was actually part of. What I respect is that when she understood the full picture, she didn't retreat into professional distance. She came forward. That took something. It took a kind of honesty that's harder than it sounds when your professional reputation is sitting in the room with you. Petra never stopped calling on Sundays. James came when it mattered. The deck in Carlton Place held through its first winter without a single board shifting. I don't think life punishes or rewards in any neat, accountable way. I think what's true is simpler and less dramatic. The choices you make under pressure reveal the person you've built yourself into. Lorraine made choices that reflected what she had decided, quietly, over years. I made choices that reflected what I had decided, quietly, over decades. Neither of us invented ourselves in that crisis. We just showed up as who we already were. What I'd say to anyone in a version of that situation, lying on a table, heart monitored, hearing something you weren't supposed to hear, is this: the steadiness you need in that moment isn't something you find on the spot. It's something you've either spent your life building or you haven't. The patience to wait before you speak. The clarity to know what you actually know. The willingness to keep going after the thing you were certain of turns out to have been something else entirely. Those aren't qualities you develop in a crisis. You develop them in all the ordinary days before the crisis arrives. And then one Tuesday morning in October, when the room is quiet and everyone thinks you're asleep, you find out whether the work was worth it. It was.